Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Academies webinar from James Cooper Creston. This glorious morning. Hopefully many of you will have watched the football last night. Those of you that know me will perhaps recognise that I am actually Scottish, but I'm delighted to say that I support England when I'm not supporting Scotland. So that was really great news. I'm head of our charities and education team. I'm joined this morning by Darren O'Connor, who's head of our academies team. Both of us work with lots of academies. We've also got Georgia Burrell from our marketing team on the call, who will deal with turning the slides in and any technology issues, which hopefully we won't have. You should all have copies of the slides on the screen. The webinar will take around half an hour. You've got the ability on your screen to ask questions, which we'll pick up on at the end. And obviously, Darren and I are very happy to deal with any questions, more detailed questions offline as well. So let's make a start. So let's move on to the next slide. So in terms of the two things that we'll be looking at, very specific items, the Academy Trust Handbook 2021, which I will be covering. And this is effective from the 1st of September 2021. When Darren and I were discussing the planning for this section, he asked me if I wanted to do that particular one. Of course, at that stage, I hadn't realised that there was a lot more changes in the Trust Handbook than there are in the Accounts Direction. So Darren will have a slightly shorter session at the end on the Academy Accounts Direction 2021, which will be relevant to your August 21 accounts. So moving on, in terms of introduction, those of you who noticed the fine detail will see that the Academy Trust Handbook has been rebranded now as the Academies Financial Handbook, but just hedging their bets, the ESFA state on the front cover of the handbook that it's also known as the Academies Financial Handbook, but the Academy Trust Handbook, we'll see the reasons for that change of name in a moment. You have to comply with the Financial Handbook as a condition of your funding agreement, so it is important. Provides an overarching framework for financial management and other controls. These are essentially your obligations as a funding body, as a publicly funded body. And we will see later some of the changes in terms of non-financial matters. So in terms of who it's relevant to members, trustees and local governors, accounting officers, chief financial officers, and of course governance professionals. And later on we'll have a look at who governance professionals are. And of course it is naturally relevant to auditors as well. So in terms of what we'll be covering in this section, we'll look at a brief overview of the handbook as a whole, but the focus will largely be on the changes from the previous year. So moving on to the foreword by Baroness Berridge, who's the Parliamentary Under Secretary of State for the School System. Quite a mouthful, that one. She always starts the handbook with a couple of pages emphasising the key messages. So she talks about the recovery from COVID-19 and how impressed she's been by how schools have adapted to the challenges. She also interestingly mentions the aspirations for all schools to be part of a confident and successful multi-academy trust. So I think clearly the ESFA is keen on the multi-academy trust model, perhaps more or increasingly so compared to the single academy trust model. Emphasises the importance of the regulatory framework and protecting children's education and of course the proper use of public money. They call this handbook the one-stop shop for academy leaders. Hopefully that will be the case. It includes pointers to non-financial areas. There are masses of links within the document to all sorts of other sources of information as well in a whole range of areas. So whilst the Trust Handbook itself runs to a not insignificant 75 pages. I think if you looked at all the pages and all the other links, it would run probably to tens of thousands. She mentions also notices to improve, so we'll see that later, the change in the terminology from financial notices to improve. Also an emphasis on parents being part of the governance process to ensure that boards are strong, stay accessible and connected to the local community. We'll see what that means a bit later. There's also a message around external governance reviews, so encouraging academies to carry these out rather than just doing self-assessment. And there is also a closing paragraphs are around cyber security, which of course is a concern for everyone, not just academies. So we'll look at a number of these issues in a bit more detail as we go through. So moving on to the overview of what the, onto the next slide in terms of an overview of what the Trust Handbook includes. For those of you who are perhaps not so familiar with it, so it lists a whole range of governance and financial responsibilities, including statutory responsibilities, references to safeguarding and health and safety this year, although generally this involves links to other documents, outlines when the ESFA's approval is needed for certain transactions such as write-offs, property transactions, etc. It talks about the balance between good governance and freedoms. Obviously, as an academy, you do have some freedoms, but it needs to be within a particular framework. It talks about managing of public money and the principles of public life. The document covers all types of academies, so single academies, multi-academy trusts, free schools, university technical colleges, etc. And just to emphasise, you must comply with it as part of your funding agreement. And the other thing, of course, it does, it sets out when the ESFA may intervene in the operation of an academy. So that's a broad overview. We move on to, in terms of using the handbook, the words must and should are important. There is a list in part 8 of the handbook of things that you have to comply with. So they are the musts. It is quite a long list. So definitely, if there's any part of the handbook that I would encourage you to read, that probably would be it. And then there's also the shoulds, which are things that you should do unless you can demonstrate that an alternative approach is more appropriate to your particular circumstances. So moving on to how the Trust Handbook is structured. So there are no changes here from 2020 in terms of the various parts, and we will go through the parts here, particularly the first 6, because the final 3 definitions, then the schedule of requirements and further reading. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of further reading, so I'm not necessarily encouraging you to read all of the links, but there is a lot of it. And then all of the first 6 changes do have some changes this year, so we'll talk a bit about those changes. So let's move on to roles and responsibilities. So we've got a couple of slides on the changes here. So it outlines the need for suitability checks for both future and existing members. This is around Section 128 of the Education and Skills Act. This covers potentially people who may be prohibited from taking part in the management of a school. I think these are checks that you will do for teaching staff, and then there is on the gov.uk and the Secure Access portal, there's the ability to access the register, which I think is maintained by the National College for Teaching and Leadership, and that will enable you to carry out these checks. One of the big changes, and certainly one of the things that's grabbed attention in the new handbook, is the requirement for parents to be part of the governance structure. So it talks about having at least 2 parents involved in a single academy trust. For multi-academy trusts, suggest either 2 parents on the board of the multi-academy trust itself, or 2 places on the local governing bodies where they are established. So potentially there is some work to do for academies in that area. There is also, this is where the references also come into some of the non-financial areas, so safeguarding, health and safety, and estate management. Now here there are masses of links to the relevant other documents. So there is a document, for example, on the estate management, which is the good estate management of schools, which is worthy of a read for those of you that are involved on the building side of things. Now, we've got a couple of polls during the webinar this morning, so some bit of audience participation. So Georgia, if we can launch the first poll, which is, do you have 2 or more parents on your board or local governing body? So just to establish what the position is at your school multi-academy trust at the moment, just to establish how schools are doing. So if we can get you to vote, so you've got 3 options: yes, no, or don't know. No shame in having a don't know answer. It may be a difficult question with some large governing bodies. It is sometimes quite difficult to establish what the background is for all the particular individuals. So just give you a few more seconds to vote there. So Georgia, if you can let us have the results of that particular poll.
Thanks, Mike. So we had 50% said yes, 33% said no, and 17% said don't know.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks very much. So the good news is that half of you are already complying. Bit of work to do, maybe for a third or so, and for the others, perhaps just checking what the situation is. So, you know, important to do that. Now, these rules come in from the 1st of September 21, so probably worth doing in the relatively near future, with perhaps a view to appointing people in the autumn term. So if you move on to the next slide, also remaining on roles and responsibilities, there is some information around the process if you're appointing a senior executive as a trustee. Now, this should be a pretty rare circumstance. Basically, the ESFA are not keen on having employed trustees other than, of course, the accounting officer. There's reference to the value of external governance reviews, particularly in the context where an academy trust is changing or growing, and these are situations where it makes sense to appoint to have perhaps an external governance review, and there are various links there in terms of how you might do that. There's reference to liaison with the regional schools commissioner when senior executive leader is leaving the trust, so to discuss structure, options, and recruitment. There is a focus in the Academy Handbook around governance professionals. So these are individuals who are typically, historically, have been called clerks. So it's interesting reading the handbook, because it's a bit more to this than just a change of name. I think the requirement is it really needs to be a governance professional. So up in the ante a bit in terms of the skills of the particular people doing this role. I was slightly skeptical when I read about this. It felt a little bit like, calling accountants finance professionals. I mean, everybody I think knows what accountants are. But let's see where we go with that. But it may be time to sort of have a look at the governance professional that you're using. And there's also a reminder about DVS checks for trustees. So if we move on to the main financial requirements, there's a bit of change or change of emphasis here. So giving a bit of information about where the scheme of delegation in terms of what relevant parties at the school are able to do, talks about reviewing this on an annual basis, or immediately if there's a change in management or organisational structure. There's some information around what you need to publish on the website around employees earning over 100,000 and encouraging you to do that in a table form. And there is also a reminder about what documents should be available for public inspection. I think generally the vast majority of academies take the approach that certain documents in terms of agendas, minutes, etc., are available for people to see if they ask for them, but not many academies actually publish those on their websites. So that's really a reminder. So if we move on to internal scrutiny, so there have been some quite significant changes here in recent times, but some of the specific ones referred to in this document. The chair of the Audit and Risk Committee should not be the same as the chair of the Finance Committee. So the requirement here around an Audit and Risk Committee, if you're over 50 million income, then you are required to have a dedicated Audit and Risk Committee. So that doesn't necessarily apply to a huge number of academies, but many other academies do have an Audit Committee in any case. A dedicated one. Of course, if you don't have a dedicated one, you need to make sure that the functions that would be carried out by an Audit and Risk Committee are covered by another committee, which is typically the Finance Committee. So the chair situation in terms of the Finance and Audit and Risk Committee, just to ensure a degree of separation. Internal scrutiny work can't be carried out by a member of the senior leadership team. And in terms of your options, many of you, I think, will be aware that the rules changed from September 2020, so that external auditors were unable to carry out internal scrutiny work because of the perceived threat to the auditor independence. So there's been quite a lot of change here. Just a reminder in terms of what your options are. Some larger multi-academy trusts may choose to have somebody in-house. You may choose to have a bought-in service from the external audit firms or other firms. You may have a non-employed trustee doing the work, or potentially a peer review by a chief financial officer from another trust. I think we are seeing fewer academies using the last two of those options, because the ESFA have upped the ante a bit in terms of internal scrutiny, and I think people are slightly more worried about it now, so therefore perhaps looking to have somebody external doing it rather than somebody either a trustee or a chief financial officer from another academy trust, who are probably incredibly busy in any case. So hopefully most of you would have sort of come up with solutions on internal scrutiny over the last few months. So if we move on to annual accounts and external audit. So the main change here, and one of particular interest, of course, to ourselves, is that trusts are now required to re-tender their audit at least every 5 years. This doesn't necessarily mean that you have to change auditors, but you need to have to go through a tender process, and it outlines some of the issues that academies need to consider. So, for example, sector experience, the quality of the individuals you'll be working with, and there's also reference to the auditor's use of technology. So there's a range of things to consider, and they're all listed in the Academies Trust Handbook when you get to that stage of re-tendering. So if we move on to delegated authorities, I mentioned changes there earlier. There is a specific change in terms of where you need to get prior ESFA approval for staff severance payments if they're over the limits outlined in the slide. That was the only change in that section. We move on to the regulator and intervention. So there is a requirement for trusts to agree that the ESFA can get information from third parties if they want it. There's some advice and guidance on cybercrime, lots of links there, and we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Not surprisingly, they're saying that no cyber ransom demands to be paid without ESFA approval, on the basis that if you make payments to the people that make these demands, there's no guarantee that you will gain access to information. There's also the likelihood that people there will come back for more. So these are threats not just to academies but to all organisations. And then, as I mentioned earlier, the financial notice to improve has now become the notice to improve, so that the emphasis here is on broader governance issues other than just financial issues, but hopefully not many of you are subject to those. So before we close on this section, I'll just cover cybercrime and fraud in a little bit more detail. So if we move on to the next slide. So a big concern of the ESFA, as it is of other regulators, for example, the Charity Commission is worried about this too. There is a reporting requirement if issues happen of you needing to report to the ESFA. Fraudsters becoming increasingly sophisticated. You need to develop a culture in the organisation where people are on the lookout for fraud. Important to look at financial controls. Good practice to review the position annually and have some board involvement, awareness and training. And of course, guarding against excessive trust and complacency. There are resources available, so the National Cyber Security Centre is referenced in the handbook, and of course Action Fraud is the government's dedicated unit, the way you report fraud. In terms of some of the key issues for academies, I think they'll involve things like segregation of duties so not over-reliance on one person, watch out for sole signatures on bank accounts and checks, etc. Watch out for changes in supplier details. So if you receive an email reporting to be from a supplier saying their bank account details have changed, always double check directly with the supplier. And then finally, the potential issues around ransomware that we have mentioned. So if we move on to just the final slide on this, just in terms of potential key actions for you to look at, review the position in terms of parents on boards, consider whether you need to have an external governance review, make sure you consult with Regional Schools Commissioner when a senior executive leader is leaving, confirm your internal scrutiny arrangements, so hopefully you've done that by now, audit tender position to be reviewed into the future, IT security, important to assess that, review the lists of musts, and this is all effective from 1st of September 2021. So that's it on the Academy Trust Handbook. I'll now hand over to Darren, who's going to talk about the accounts direction. Darren.
Thank you very much, Mike. As Mike quite rightly pointed out at the beginning, I've probably got the shorter section this time round. It hasn't always been the case, but the accounts direction, I'm sure most of you will be pleased to know that there are very few changes this year. So just as a recap, the accounts direction for 2021 covers the period ended 31st of August 2021. And it covers the details required for preparing a set of financial statements for that period. Many business managers, accounting officers and so on in the past have commented that the accounts can be very long, in some cases repetitive, and some of the reasons for that is around the number of regulations and legislations that are cross and overlap within the Academy sector. So to name a few, the Companies Act, the Charity SORP and Charities Act. There are some specific ESFA requirements as well as funding agreement requirements. So all in all, that is why we end up with sets of accounts that are 40 plus, perhaps 50 or 60 pages plus. But as I said, this time round, very few changes and no changes in the underlying accounting principles. So it's really fine tuning rather than a major overhaul of the accounts direction. So on to the next slide, please, Georgia. So the main change, I suppose, has been from a presentation point of view. The accounts direction each year was increasing in size, and the ESFA have decided now to break it down into 3 documents. First one being the Academy's accounts direction, which, as I said, covers off how to prepare a set of Academy accounts and under what principles. So that part of the, when compared to previous years, is substantially slimmed down. There is a separate document now with the model accounts, or as most people refer to it as the Coketown model of accounts, is now in a separate document. And that essentially allows users of the accounts to see what they should look like and what disclosures should be within your accounts. And then there is a third document this year called the Framework and Guide for External Auditors and Reporting Accountants of Academy Trust. Very long-winded title. I do sit on an ESFA Academy Auditor Forum where we were asked did we want to shorten the name. Unfortunately, none of us could come up with a better term. Perhaps that says something about creativity and accountants. But I think what's important there is just to note it is for the external auditors, but there are some useful pieces of information in there for your school business manager, financial officer, or accounting officer that may be relevant when it comes to preparing your accounts and preparing for the audit. The main driver behind moving to 3 documents, the ESFA have said that it should make it easier for users to follow the accounts direction, and it improves the structure and flow. Thank you, Georgia. On to the next, please. So moving on to some of the specific changes. Within the trustees report, the ESFA have elaborated on the financial review section. Particularly, the ESFA are asking for Academy Trust to explain the figures and the reasons for movement. So that could be movements when compared to the prior year, or could be compared to your budgets. And to tell the story, link it into the activities and the objectives and the success stories of the Academy within the year and how that has played out in the financial figures. Within the document, the ESFA encourage Academy Trust to use non-accountant terms. So let's not get too carried away with accounting descriptions and terminology. It should be for all users to understand. Within the trustees report, there is also a statement now that you do need to disclose if there has been a financial notice to improve. Mike mentioned the name is changing, but that is changing from September onwards. So for the accounts that we're looking at here, it would still be a financial notice to improve. So the statement should include a link to the actual financial notice to improve on the ESFA website. It should include the period it covers and also any actions that have been taken to date will be taken, and any measures that are ongoing. Thank you, Georgia. On to the next, please. So moving to the governance statement, many see this as part of the trustees report. It is a separate statement. The ESFA have reinforced and reminded Academy Trust to avoid using boilerplate disclosures. Within their commentary on recent reviews of sets of financial statements, the ESFA commented that there is from time to time cut and copy sections coming straight out of the accounts direction and being placed into Academy Trust accounts. They mentioned, for one, that may lead to issues with facts. Are you actually telling the story of what has happened at the Academy Trust? And also can lead to contradictory paragraphs where part of the document has been updated and part still includes boilerplate coat town disclosures. So a reminder to ensure that you do need to review the whole document and avoid cut and copy exercises. Internal scrutiny is an area that Mike has already commented on, but the ESFA are expecting to see a paragraph or two explaining what changes the Academy Trust have made, what the results or conclusions on the internal scrutiny were, and any ongoing or outstanding actions as a result of those changes in procedures. Just a reminder that that all Academy Trusts should be confirming that they meet 6 times a year. Don't worry if you do not currently meet 6 times a year, but you do need to explain how the Trust is ensuring effective governance while carrying out fewer than 6 meetings a year. The governance statement is also, sorry, just one last part in that one, Georgia. The governance review is also an area that the ESFA are keen that academies expand on and ensure that they are self-assessing their governance arrangements. The ESFA accept that no trust is perfect and there are always areas of improvement and continuous improvement to look at. Thank you, Georgia. So moving to the figures within the accounts, or the back end of the accounts, I suppose, there are very few areas of changes. Staff cost note is one. Off payroll arrangements is something that HMRC have been looking at for a number of years, and it's now flowing more into both the private and the public sector. There is a requirement now to disclose any off-payroll arrangements, including the amounts paid to any individual that is not an employee, and also to update the prior year comparative. So essentially, we're now disclosing the amounts paid to non-employees, just as we would employees. Just a reminder that you do need to seek prior approval if the accounting officer or the CFO is not an employee and is not on the payroll. I think it's fair to say that the ESFA are moving to a position where they would prefer to see no off-payroll arrangements within the academy sector. Thank you, Georgia. So the income note will change slightly. Many of you will have seen in the past that within the income note you have various headings, and then there is a final heading called Other DFE and ESFA grants, where you normally find all other grants sit, and can in some cases be quite a large number and can move year on year and can be quite hard to explain on the face of it. So the ESFA have now asked for additional lines to be added into your accounts, just to avoid this blanket bucket heading. This is to help to align to the accounts return, and will also aid perhaps in the future the use of the chart of accounts, where each of these grants will have a separate nominal code or chart within the accounts, and will flow straight into both your accounts and your accounts return. Thank you, Georgia. So we're through to overview. So I think you'll be pleased to see that there are only a few changes there, and it's fine tuning rather than an overhaul. The main focus, I suppose, from my view, from reading through the accounts direction, is the ESFA are looking for an improvement in the trustees report, and particularly in how it reads and how coherent it is. My recommendation always would be to draft early. Please do not leave it to the last minute, and that includes getting trustee buy-in early on. We still do see some cases where the business manager and the accounting officer have drafted the report, and the trustees have not seen it till quite late in the day. So having early buy-in and input, I think, is very useful. The only other comment I'd make there is, as mentioned, there are 3 documents this year. There will be a 4th document, much like last year. A supplementary bulletin will be released, and that is due imminently, and that will cover off COVID-19 and any impacts that may have on the accounts. So I do have a poll now, and hopefully Georgia can bring that up for us. So the question is, have the changes to the trustees report in recent years improved the usefulness of the document? So that's a yes, no, or don't know answer. Again, as Mike mentioned, no shame in don't know. It is a very long report, and perhaps it's more useful in some areas than others, but it would just be interesting to hear your thoughts. So we'll open the poll now. I'll read the question one more time. Have the changes to the trustees report in recent years improved the usefulness of the document? I'll just wait a few moments to allow you to both ponder and put your results, your answer in. So, Georgia, do we have a result?
Oh, thanks, Darren. So we've got for yes, 42%,
Okay.
for no, 25%, and don't know, 33%. So quite a few more don't knows this time. Yeah,
that's very interesting. And I think in some ways would mirror my opinion too, that I think in some areas, the trustees report, the clarity has certainly improved in last year's. But like many documents, you find that each year you add to it and it becomes a longer and longer document. Very few instances of removal of sections, and it does seem to get longer and longer and harder for someone to read, particularly if they don't have an hour to spend to read it from cover to cover. So interesting results, and something I'm sure the ESFA would be interested in hearing. So I think that covers off the overview. So over to the next slide, please. So just a reminder of the main publications. The top 2 there we've talked about in detail today. There's also a number of good practice guides on the ESFA website, which is a useful document to look at when you have a spare moment. And the letter to accounting officers are also very useful and give a good indication of the direction of travel within the ESFA. You tend to find what is included in the accounting officer letters soon finds its way into the financial handbook or the accounts direction. So it does flag the direction of travel. Next page, please. So just a reminder of the deadlines. The messaging coming out of the ESFA is that it is a return to normal, and they don't envisage any extensions at this point in time. So the accounts and the management letter to be filed by the 31st of December. Realistically, with Christmas, that probably means the 20th of December or whenever the closest day to schools closing for term time. A reminder, the accounts return is then broadly a month later, 25th of January this year. And also in January, you do need to, and I suppose it's quite easy to forget, is the financial statements do need to be uploaded onto your websites. And the ESFA have made it very clear that a link to Companies House is not sufficient, is insufficient, that it does need to be an actual PDF download. And then the accounts need to be filed at Companies House by the end of May.
Okay. Thanks very much, Darren. So I think we're nearly at the end now. So here's a couple of photographs of Darren and I when we were young men. We're very pleased with these. So we've got some links on that slide to the accounts direction and the Academy Trust Handbook and various other bits and pieces. Lots of further reading for you if you want to. Georgia, what sort of questions have we had through?
We've had a couple of questions, but I'm just mindful of the time. So maybe just one question, then we can get back to the others afterwards. So I think this one sounds like one for you, Darren. Do you think Academy Trust should start to adopt ESFA chart of accounts?
Okay, interesting one. As I mentioned, I sit on the auditor forum and the ESFA do try their very hardest to gain our opinion before bringing in new initiatives. One the ESFA are pushing quite hard is the chart of accounts. I think in an ideal world, the ESFA would like to get to a position where the business managers would be able to review the management accounts, though the coding would then push through into your financial statements and then into your accounts return and also into other reporting requirements throughout the year. Whether trust will ever get there or get there in the short term is debatable, but it's certainly a direction of travel. Some of the software providers are now on board with this, albeit some of the larger ones are not quite there yet. But I suppose to answer the question in short is I think it's something the ESFA will continue to push. So each Academy Trust should be mindful of that. Is there an immediate need to change this year or next year? Probably not. But making sure that you are talking to your software providers to ensure that if it did become a must within the handbook or the accounts direction, but presumably the handbook, that you would be able to jump over a relatively within a relatively short space of time. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thanks very much, Darren. So I think we're now at the end. So Georgia will sort of email you details of the webinar. For those of you that want to enjoyed it so much that you want to watch it again, or perhaps more relevantly, if there's anyone else in your organisation you think might be useful, the webinar will also be in due course uploaded onto our website. I'd like to thank Darren for his contribution and Georgia for dealing with the presentation and all the technology. And finally, of course, I'd like to thank you all for joining us. Hopefully there was a few points of interest for you. Do contact us if there's anything that you think of post-webinar, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.
Thank you.